She snatched the menu right out of his hands. Didn't ask, didn't hesitate. Just reached across that first-class seat and yanked it away like it belonged to her and never to him. Then she leaned down close enough that the boy could smell the coffee on her breath and said it loud. Loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "First class isn't for kids like you." 11 years old, sitting in a seat his father paid for. And in that moment, every head in first class turned, and not a single person said a word. Not one. A child was just told he didn't belong. And the silence that followed was louder than anything she could have said. If this kind of story makes your blood boil the way it does mine, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you, justice does come. And drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened on that flight, you have to understand the boy sitting in seat 2A. Brandon Fletcher was 11 years old, and he carried himself the way some kids just do, with a quietness that wasn't shyness and a stillness that wasn't fear. He was the kind of child who listened before he spoke, who watched people carefully, the way old souls do, like he was always taking notes on the world around him. He had his backpack tucked neatly under the seat in front of him, a book in his lap he hadn't opened yet, and his noise-canceling headphones hanging around his neck, a birthday gift from his father that he treated like treasure. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't making noise. He was doing everything right. His father, Derek Fletcher, had put him on this flight alone, not because he was irresponsible, but because Brandon had done this before. Short hops, supervised. Derek had arranged everything through SkyVault's unaccompanied minor program, paid the additional fee, filed the paperwork, and personally walked Brandon to the gate. He'd bought the first-class ticket because he wanted his son comfortable. He wanted him to have the window seat, the warm meal, the legroom, the experience of being treated well. Because Derek Fletcher knew better than most what it meant to be in a room where people assumed you didn't belong. He'd lived that. He had decided long ago that his son wouldn't have to. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he stood at that Atlanta gate and watched his boy disappear down the jetway, was that the decision to buy that seat to give his son that experience was about to set off a chain of events that would shake an entire airline to its foundation. Brandon found his seat without any trouble. He was polite to the gate agent who walked him down. He said thank you. He stowed his bag properly. He sat down in seat 2, a window seat, first class left side, and he looked out at the tarmac and thought about Chicago, about the weekend ahead, about his cousin's birthday party, and the sneakers he'd picked out as a gift. He was just a kid on a plane thinking about normal kid things. The cabin filled slowly, business travelers mostly. Men in suits checking emails on phones they never put down, a woman in a silk blouse who smelled expensive, a couple in their 60s who settled into their seats with the ease of people who'd done this 1,000 times. Nobody paid Brandon any particular attention when they boarded. He was just there in the window seat, quiet and still. That was when Cynthia Holloway appeared. She was the senior flight attendant on this route, had been for years. SkyVault's Atlanta to Chicago corridor was her territory, and she operated it with a precision that bordered on territorial. She knew every regular. She knew which passengers would order the salmon and which ones would complain about the temperature. She'd built a reputation as efficient, professional, unflappable. Her colleagues respected her. Her supervisors praised her. The airline had given her awards. She came down the aisle doing her pre-departure check, and she stopped when she reached row 2. She looked at Brandon, and something shifted in her face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sneer or a scowl or anything that someone watching from a distance would necessarily have clocked. It was subtler than that. It was the kind of look that people who have spent their whole lives being looked at that way recognize instantly. The slight narrowing of the eyes, the recalibration, the silent question that wasn't really a question, it was an answer she'd already decided on. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to make it feel like a command dressed up as a request. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Brandon looked up. He reached into his jacket pocket. His father had told him to keep it there, not in his bag, and he pulled out the boarding pass and handed it to her. She looked at it for a long moment, longer than she needed to. "This says 2A, she said. "Yes, ma'am," Brandon said. "That's where I'm sitting." She handed it back. Didn't say anything else, not right away. She moved on with her check, and Brandon thought that was the end of it. He put his headphones on, not playing anything yet, just wearing them, because his father had said they were a good way to signal that you didn't want to be bothered. He picked up his book. That was when she came back. She reached across, no warning, no explanation, and she took the menu right out of his hands. The laminated first-class menu with the gold Sky Vault logo at the top, listing the warm meals and the premium beverages and the dessert selections. She took it like it was hers to take, like his hands had no claim to it. Brandon's head came up. His headphones slipped down around his neck. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was steady because his father had raised him to speak steadily, even when his heart was pounding. "This cabin is for adult passengers," Cynthia said. She said it loud. She said it the way you say something when you want the whole room to hear you say it. "I have a first-class ticket," Brandon said. "I'm aware of what your ticket says." She set the menu down on the service cart, away from him. "But first class has a standard of service, and it's my job to manage that. I'm not bothering anyone. That's not what I said." "Then what are you saying?" And right here was where she crossed the line that no apology could ever fully uncross. She looked at him with something cold in her eyes, something that had nothing to do with airline policy or cabin management or anything professional at all, and she said, "First class isn't for kids like you." The words landed like a stone in still water. The ripples went everywhere. The man in 2C, a heavy-set white man in a charcoal suit mid-50s, the kind of man who had probably never in his life been told he didn't belong somewhere, looked up from his laptop. He made eye contact with Brandon for just a second, then he looked back at his screen. The woman across the aisle lowered her magazine just slightly, just enough to see. Then she raised it again. The couple in their 60s settled in 3A and 3B went very still. The husband reached for his wife's hand. Neither of them said anything. An entire cabin of adults watched a child be told he didn't belong in a seat his father paid for. And the silence that followed was its own kind of verdict. Brandon didn't cry. That's the thing that matters. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He pulled his headphones back up around his neck, and he looked Cynthia Holloway in the eye, and he said with a clarity that seemed too old for his face, "My father paid for this seat. I belong here." That calm, that absolute refusal to crumble did something to Cynthia that anger might not have done. It rattled her, because when you expect a child to break and the child doesn't break, the power you thought you had reveals itself to be something smaller and uglier than you realized. She stiffened. "I'm going to need to verify your documentation." "I gave you my boarding pass." "I need more than a boarding pass. You're listed as an unaccompanied minor. I need to verify the program paperwork." Brandon reached into his bag, carefully, calmly, and produced the bright orange, unaccompanied minor folder that the gate agent had given him at check-in. Everything was in it. The form signed by his father, the contact information, the authorization, everything Sky Vault required. He held it out to her. She took it. She read it. She took longer than she needed to read it. Then she handed it back. "I'll need to speak with my purser." "Okay," Brandon said. She walked away. The man in 2C cleared his throat. He glanced over at Brandon. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like he might say something human, something that would have cost him nothing. Brandon looked back at him, and the man looked away, and that was the end of that. The purser's name was Gerald Watts. He was in his 40s, slim, with the kind of practiced calm that comes from years of managing people in pressurized aluminum tubes at 35,000 feet. He was good at his job. He prided himself on that. He came down the aisle with the measured walk of a man who has handled situations before. Cynthia met him at the front galley, and she spoke to him in a voice low enough that Brandon couldn't hear the words. But he could see her face. He could see the way her hands moved. He could see the moment Gerald's expression shifted from neutral to something more complicated. Gerald walked over. He crouched down slightly, not all the way, not enough to actually put himself at eye level with an 11-year-old, just enough to make the gesture, and he said, "Hey, buddy, can I see your ticket?" Brandon had already been through this. He produced the boarding pass again. Gerald looked at it. "And you're the unaccompanied minor?" "Yes, sir." "Okay. And do you understand that first class has some specific expectations around—" "I'm not doing anything wrong," Brandon said. "I'm sitting in my seat. I haven't asked for anything. I haven't bothered anyone." She took my menu away and told me, "First class isn't for kids like me." Gerald's jaw did something complicated. "I understand you feel—" "I don't feel anything," Brandon said. "I'm telling you what happened." Gerald stood back up. He looked at Cynthia. He looked at the passengers in first class, every single one of them looking very carefully at something other than this conversation. He was the adult with the authority to end this right here. To look at a child with valid paperwork in a legitimately purchased seat and say, "You stay right where you are. Nobody touches your menu. Nobody tells you where you belong." Instead, Gerald Watts chose the comfortable thing. "I think it might be better," he said carefully, "if we got you settled somewhere with a little more support available. For unaccompanied minors, we typically recommend—" "My paperwork authorizes first class," Brandon said. "I understand that, but I think my father paid for this seat." "I hear you, but our cabin crew needs to be able to manage this flight effectively, and I think we'd all be more comfortable if—" "I'm comfortable," Brandon said. "I'm the only one who's supposed to be comfortable. It's my seat." Gerald Watts looked at the 11-year-old boy sitting in seat 2, with more composure than half the adults in the cabin, and he made his choice. He said, "I'm going to ask you to gather your things." The silence in that cabin shifted. It went from the silence of people looking away to the silence of people who knew somewhere in the parts of themselves they didn't like to examine that something wrong was happening, and they were allowing it to happen. Brandon looked at Gerald for a long moment. Then he unclipped his seatbelt. He reached under the seat and pulled out his backpack. He stood up, and he was small. He was 11 years old, and he was small, and the overhead bins towered over him, and the aisle stretched long behind him, and he shouldered his bag, and he picked up his unaccompanied minor folder, and he walked. He walked from seat 2A past the galley curtain, past the rows of people in business class, into economy, down the aisle with the overhead bins getting lower and the seats getting narrower and the carpet getting more worn, all the way to row 34, seat B, middle seat, between a man who smelled like cigarettes and a woman who was already asleep against the window. He sat down. He buckled his seatbelt. He put his backpack under the seat in front of him. He put his book in the seat pocket. He put his headphones on. He stared at the back of the seat in front of him, and he did not let himself cry. The plane pushed back from the gate 40 minutes later. By that point, the first-class cabin had settled back into its rhythms, drinks being poured laptops, open the quiet hum of luxury, continuing uninterrupted. Nobody mentioned the boy. Nobody brought him up. The man in 2C ordered the salmon. The woman across the aisle asked for a second glass of champagne. In seat 34B, Brandon Fletcher had not been offered anything. The economy flight attendant came through with the drink cart, and Brandon asked politely for water. She handed it to him without eye contact and moved on. He hadn't eaten since that morning his father had promised him the first-class meal would be the event, the thing to look forward to, the warm food and the real cutlery and the little dish of warm nuts they always brought out before service. He'd been looking forward to it the way kids look forward to things with specific, detailed anticipation. He was thirsty. He was hungry. He was 34 rows away from the seat he'd done nothing wrong to lose. And then Cynthia appeared. She had no reason to come to economy. The first-class galley was her domain. But there she was, walking the aisle with the controlled stride of someone who wanted to be seen making a check, and she stopped at row 34. She looked at Brandon, and something crossed her face that was almost satisfaction, not the open, ugly kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that people feel when they've reasserted what they believe to be the correct order of things. "You're doing okay back here?" she asked. She said it with a smile. Brandon looked up at her. "I'm fine," he said. "Good." She nodded once. "We'll have economy service coming through shortly." She walked back up the aisle. The man in the window seat of row 33, a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a thick southern accent, he didn't bother to soften, turned around and looked at Brandon over the headrest. "Was that the woman who moved you?" he asked. Brandon looked at him. "Yes, sir." The man's expression did something. He started to reach into his own bag like he was going to offer something, food maybe, or just acknowledgement, the kind that costs nothing but means everything. And then the man on the other side of the aisle caught his eye and gave a small, barely perceptible shake of his head. The kind of look that says, "Don't get involved." The southern man hesitated. Then he turned back around. Brandon saw all of it. He was 11 years old, and he saw every single bit of it, and he understood it, and he filed it away in that part of himself that was paying attention to the world that was learning what it meant to move through certain spaces in certain skin. He pulled out his book. He opened it. He didn't read a word. About an hour into the flight, a woman from 3 rows back tapped him on the shoulder. She was maybe 60, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of face that had laugh lines and worry lines in equal measure. She leaned forward and said quietly, "Honey, do you want some of my crackers? I've got too many." Brandon turned to look at her. She was holding out a little packet of crackers, the kind the economy snack service had come through with 30 minutes ago, the same service where he'd asked for water and been handed it without eye contact. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it. He meant it the way you mean something when it's the only decent thing that's happened to you in a long time. He opened the crackers. He ate them carefully, one at a time, looking straight ahead. That was when Cynthia reappeared. She must have seen it from the front, must have caught the exchange from where she was standing near the galley curtain, because she came down the aisle with a purpose that had nothing to do with a routine check, and she stopped at row 34, and she looked at the crackers in Brandon's hand, and she looked at the woman behind him. "Ma'am," she said to the woman, "I need to ask you not to share food with other passengers." The woman stared at her. "Excuse me. It's a policy, cross-contamination allergen liability. I need to make sure everyone's—" "He's a child," the woman said. Her voice had gone flat in a way that meant she'd moved past confusion directly into anger. "He's an 11-year-old child, and you moved him out of first class where there was food, and now you won't let someone give him crackers. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but—" "No, I don't think you do." The cabin around them had gone quiet. The buzzing, low-grade noise of an airplane in flight, the conversations, the entertainment systems, the shuffle and rustle of 100 people in close quarters, all of it seemed to pull back just a little, just enough to create a ring of silence around row 34. Cynthia kept her voice very professional, very smooth. "I'm going to have to ask you to—" "You're going to have to ask me nothing," the woman said. "I didn't break any rule by offering a child food, and if you want to escalate this, you go right ahead, because I will be very happy to speak to whoever you need me to speak to." A beat of silence. Cynthia's jaw was tight. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," she said. She turned and walked back up the aisle. The woman behind Brandon leaned forward again. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" Brandon had been holding himself very still. He exhaled slowly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." He finished the crackers. He thought about his father, about the way Derek had stood at the gate that morning, hands in his pockets watching him walk down the jetway. His father had this way of looking at him not with worry exactly, but with something adjacent to it. Like he was always calculating the world on his son's behalf, always running the numbers, always factoring in variables that a child shouldn't have to think about. Brandon had wanted to tell him not to worry. He'd waved from the end of the jetway, Grin turned the corner. He thought about that now, about that grin, about the version of himself that had existed 45 minutes ago in seat 2A with a menu in his hands and a whole flight stretching out ahead of him, ordinary and good. He wanted to call his father. It was a simple thought, the most natural thought in the world for an 11-year-old in a situation that had gone wrong. Call your dad. That's what you do. His father had given him a phone, for exactly this reason, had sat him down and walked him through every scenario, had said, "If anything ever feels wrong, you call me, you hear me. I don't care what time it is. I don't care where I am. You call me." Brandon pressed the call button above his seat. A different flight attendant, a younger woman, not Cynthia, appeared. "What do you need, hon?" "I'd like to use my phone to call my father," Brandon said. "I know we're in the air, but I have a message app. Can I access the in-flight Wi-Fi?" The young attendant looked uncertain. She glanced toward the front of the plane toward Cynthia. "Let me check on that," she said. She walked up the aisle. Brandon watched her go. He watched her reach the galley. He watched the short, low conversation she had with Cynthia, who was standing with her back mostly to him. He watched the young attendant walk back. "I'm sorry, hun," she said. "In-flight Wi-Fi access for unaccompanied minors has to be authorized through the supervising attendant. She said she hasn't completed the authorization yet." "She moved me out of first class and won't authorize my Wi-Fi," Brandon said. He said it clearly. Not as a complaint, as a statement of fact, the kind of fact that deserves to be said clearly. The young attendant looked uncomfortable in a way that was different from Cynthia's discomfort. This wasn't the discomfort of someone protecting a bad decision. This was the discomfort of someone who knew she was standing inside a situation that was wrong and didn't have the power to fix it. "I'm sorry," she said again, and she sounded like she meant it. "I'm really sorry." She walked away. Brandon sat in seat 34B between the man who smelled like cigarettes and the woman sleeping against the window, and he was hungry, and he was disconnected, and he was still carrying the orange unaccompanied minor folder in his lap with all the documentation that said he was authorized, approved, accounted for, and none of it had mattered. He opened his book again. He stared at the words without reading them. Up in first class, Cynthia Holloway moved through the cabin with the practiced ease of someone who believes they have handled a situation. She poured drinks. She smiled at the man in 2C. She offered the couple in row 3 a second round of warm nuts. She did her job with the efficiency she'd built a career on. What she didn't know, what nobody on that plane knew yet, was that the moment she moved an 11-year-old boy out of seat 2, AA system flag had triggered in SkyVault's operations center, an unauthorized seat reassignment on a flight with an unaccompanied minor, an alert, a data point that floated up through the airline's management system like a bubble rising through deep water, quiet and invisible, finding its way toward the surface. And at the surface, at a desk in a building in Chicago, watching a monitor with the focused attention of a man who never fully stops watching, was Derek Fletcher, who saw the flag, who saw the seat number, who saw his son's name. Brandon didn't know that yet. He was still staring at his book, trying to hold himself together the way his father had taught him, with his back straight and his face still and his breathing slow. Somewhere above the clouds, the plane was moving through clean air at 500 miles an hour, carrying a boy who had been told he didn't belong toward a city where something was already in motion. The crackers were gone. The water bottle was empty. The flight had another hour left. The hour that followed was the longest of Brandon Fletcher's life, not because anything dramatic was happening. That was almost the worst part. The plane hummed along at cruising altitude, indifferent and mechanical, and the world inside that cabin continued its quiet, ordinary rotations. People napping, people watching movies on tiny screens, people ordering their second drinks without looking up. The normal machinery of a flight going nowhere unusual. And in the middle of all that normalcy, a boy sat in a middle seat that wasn't his and stared at a page that meant nothing and kept his breathing even and slow because his father had told him when things go wrong, the first thing you protect is your breath. Everything else follows from that. He was still hungry. He'd eaten the crackers the woman behind him had offered, slowly, deliberately making them last, and after that there had been nothing. The economy snack service had passed him a second time, and he'd asked for a second water which came with the same absent efficiency as the first placed on his tray table, without eye contact, without a word. He wasn't going to ask for food. Not from them. Not after what had already happened. He had his pride, and it was one of the few things left in his possession that hadn't been touched. The man beside him, the one who smelled of old cigarettes and leather, had fallen asleep somewhere over Indiana. Chin dropped to his chest, snoring at a low, consistent rumble. The woman on his other side was still pressed against the window, using her folded cardigan as a pillow. Brandon was wedged between two sleeping strangers in a seat that was designed for bodies smaller than his father's, but somehow still felt too small for the weight he was carrying. He closed his book, put it in the seat pocket, folded his hands in his lap. He thought about the moment Cynthia had taken the menu. He kept replaying it, not to torture himself, but because his mind was the kind of mind that needed to understand things, needed to find the seam in the logic of events. He couldn't find one. There was no policy. There was no rule. He'd been sitting correctly, holding a menu, correctly existing correctly in a seat that was documented and authorized and paid for, and she had reached across and taken it like his hands were a mistake. "First class isn't for kids like you." He turned the phrase over, examined it from all its angles. Kids like you, not unaccompanied minors. That would have been a policy, something to push back against with documentation. Not children. That would have been a rule equally applicable, something general and impersonal. Kids like you. That word, like, that specific, deliberate, chosen word. Brandon was 11, but he wasn't naive. He knew what "like you" meant. He had known for several years now in the way that black children in America come to know things not all at once, not in a single conversation, but in the accumulation of moments. The store clerk who followed his mother. The birthday party where the other kid's parents had looked at his father with that particular expression. The teacher who was always surprised when he knew the answer. He knew. He had just hoped, he had genuinely, sincerely hoped, that at 35,000 feet, in a sealed metal tube, where the only relevant facts were the ticket in your pocket and the seat number on the boarding pass, it might not follow him. He exhaled, long and slow. The young flight attendant, the one who had apologized, whose name tag he hadn't caught, appeared at the end of his row. She wasn't doing a service pass. She was walking with the careful, deliberate casualness of someone trying not to look like they're doing what they're doing. She stopped at his row and crouched down beside his seat and said very quietly, "Hey, are you doing okay?" Brandon looked at her. She had brown eyes, and she looked genuinely uncomfortable, which he'd decided was the honest version of what had been happening around him all flight. Not okay with it, just not powerful enough to stop it. "I'm okay," he said. "I wanted you to know I didn't agree with what happened, with the seat change." She glanced up the aisle. "I couldn't say that earlier, but you're saying it now." "Yes, because—" She hesitated. Then, "Because we're about 40 minutes out, and I think you deserve to have someone say it." Brandon nodded. He appreciated it. He did. But he was also old enough to understand the geography of what she was offering a whispered apology in an economy row, while the person who had actually made the decision was still up front untouched, pouring champagne. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. "Melissa." "Melissa," he said. "Did you file anything about what happened? An incident report?" Something shifted in her expression, something that looked like shame. That's above my—" Gerald could have filed one. The purser. "I know." He didn't. "No," she said. He didn't. Silence between them, short and heavy. "Is there anything I can do for you right now?" she asked. "That I'm actually able to do?" Brandon thought about it. Really thought about it. "No," he said. "But thank you for asking." She stood up. She walked back toward the front. He watched her go. He reached into his jacket pocket, the one his father had told him to keep the boarding pass in, and he felt around until his fingers found the edge of his phone. He pulled it out, looked at the screen. No signal, obviously. No Wi-Fi. He turned it over in his hands, this object that was supposed to connect him to his father, and couldn't, and he thought about Derek standing at the gate that morning, hands in his pockets, watching. He put the phone away. He told himself 40 minutes. 40 minutes, and the wheels touch down, and his father will be there, or there will be a message from his father, or he will be able to call his father. 40 minutes is nothing. 40 minutes is a television episode. He could do 40 minutes. And that was when the man in the seat directly in front of him, row 33 aisle seat, turned around. Brandon hadn't noticed him before. He was maybe 50 with short gray hair and a wedding ring, and the particular kind of expensive casual clothes that suggested he was a man who worked hard to appear as though he didn't care about such things. He'd been facing forward the whole flight, earbuds, in never acknowledging the row behind him. He leaned over his headrest now, and he looked at Brandon, and he said not unkindly, but not kindly, either in the flat, measured tone of a man used to being listened to, "I saw what happened up there." Brandon waited. "You've got to understand," the man continued, "that some people in these situations, people in that woman's position, they're just doing their job, trying to keep order. It's nothing personal." Brandon looked at him. "She said, first class isn't for kids like you. What part of that is impersonal?" The man blinked. He clearly hadn't expected that. He recalibrated. "What I'm saying is, look, you handled yourself really well. You kept your cool. But sometimes the best thing is just to let it go. Don't carry it with you. You're young. You've got your whole life ahead of—" "Did you hear what she said to me?" Brandon asked. "I did. And you didn't say anything." The man's jaw tightened. "It's complicated." "You're an adult," Brandon said. "I'm 11. You were 2 feet away from me, and you didn't say one word. And now you're telling me to let it go." He paused. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful, sir, but that's not the same thing as helping." The man in 33A looked at Brandon Fletcher for a long moment. Then he turned back around in his seat. The woman behind Brandon, the one with the crackers and the reading glasses, made a quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was the sound of someone who had just seen something small, but true. Brandon leaned his head back, closed his eyes. 35 minutes left. What he didn't know, what none of them on that plane knew, was what was already in motion on the ground. The Skyvault Operations Center in Chicago occupied the 4th floor of a building that ran on controlled chaos screens everywhere. Radio chatter, the constant movement of information about hundreds of flights in the air at any given moment. The people who worked there were trained to see anomalies, to treat a flag in the system the way a doctor treats an irregular heartbeat, with immediate focused attention. The flag that had appeared 45 minutes ago was specific unauthorized seat reassignment, unaccompanied minor flight 1147, Atlanta to Chicago. A minor moved from first class to economy without documentation, without authorization, without parental consent. Against Skyvault's own unaccompanied minor protocol, which required written authorization from a parent or guardian before any change to seat assignment could be made, the flag moved up the chain. And the chain on this particular afternoon led through 2 supervisors and 1 very short phone call directly to the executive suite. Derek Fletcher had a meeting. He was in the middle of it, a quarterly review with 3 of his regional directors' numbers up on a screen. Someone mid-sentence about load factors on the southeast corridor when his assistant knocked and opened the door in the way that meant she wasn't going to wait to be acknowledged. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "Operations needs you." He was out of his chair before she finished the sentence. The details came to him in pieces as he walked down the hallway fast, the way he moved when he was operating on instinct rather than deliberation. His son's flight, a system flag, a seat change. His son moved. His son, who had all the right documentation, all the right authorization, all the right paperwork that Derek himself had filed and confirmed, moved to economy without consent, and now 40 minutes out over Lake Michigan, unable to access Wi-Fi because the supervising flight attendant hadn't authorized it. Derek Fletcher stopped in the middle of the hallway. He stood very still for exactly 4 seconds. The people around him, assistants, directors, analysts, who had worked with him for years, recognized that stillness. They had seen it before. It was the stillness that preceded absolute precision of action. He said quietly to his director of operations, "Get me the name of every crew member on Flight 1147. "Yes, sir." "Get me the complete incident log from departure through current time." "Yes, sir." "And get me a gate agent at O'Hare. I want someone at that gate when that plane lands, not a supervisor. Me." He was already moving again. "I'll be there myself." There was a pause of exactly 1 beat, the kind of pause that happens when people who have known someone for years realize they are watching something shift in real time. "Yes, sir," his director said, and reached for his phone. Derek was already heading for the elevator. Back in the air in seat 34, B. Brandon had gone somewhere quiet inside himself. Not checked out, he was still present, still watching, still processing, but he had made a decision in the way that children sometimes make decisions quietly and completely without ceremony. He had decided that he was going to get off this plane the same way he got on it, with his back straight, his boarding pass in his pocket, and his father's voice in his head. He was going to walk off that plane, and he was going to tell his father exactly what had happened, beginning to end, leaving nothing out. And then whatever happened next was going to happen. He had almost made peace with the remaining time when Cynthia came back. She appeared at the front of the economy cabin, the way she always appeared, with the professional walk, the practiced expression, the total command of physical space that she'd refined over a career of controlling environments. She moved down the aisle, doing what looked like a final pre-landing check. She stopped at the rows with trash to collect. She smiled at a passenger who flagged her. She was doing her job. She reached row 34. She looked at Brandon. She said, "We'll be landing in about 20 minutes. You'll need to stay in your seat until a gate agent comes for you." "I know the procedure," Brandon said. "Good." She started to move. "Can I ask you something?" Brandon said. She stopped, turned back. Her expression was professionally neutral. "Of course." "Why did you do it?" A pause. "Do what?" "Move me." Take my menu. Tell me first class isn't for kids like me." He held her gaze. "Was there a rule? Was there a policy I broke? Is there something in the Sky Vault manual that says what you did was correct?" Cynthia Holloway looked at an 11-year-old boy, asking her a direct question in a voice that didn't shake. "I made a judgment call," she said, "based on the needs of the cabin." "The needs of the cabin," Brandon repeated. "That's right. What about my needs?" She didn't answer. "I was hungry," he said. "I asked for my meal and you took my menu. I asked to call my father and you blocked my Wi-Fi. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't bother anyone. I showed you every piece of documentation my father filed." He paused. What did I do wrong? Cynthia's professional neutrality was still in place, but something beneath it was working hard. He could see it in the microtension around her mouth, in the way her eyes were moving slightly too fast. "This conversation isn't appropriate right now," she said. "We're preparing for landing." "You started the conversation," he said. "You came to my row." "I was doing a check, I know." He looked at her. "What did I do wrong?" She said nothing. She turned and walked away, and her walk was exactly the same as it had always been, controlled, professional, unhurried, except that Brandon noticed in the way he noticed things that she didn't stop at any other row in economy on her way back to the front. The woman behind him leaned forward one more time. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand briefly on his shoulder, the lightest possible touch there and gone, and he knew what it meant, and he nodded slightly, and she leaned back. The seatbelt sign came on. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and routine, the usual information about descent and weather and local time. The cabin began the quiet reorganization of landing tray tables, up seats forward, window shades open. The sound of O'Hare approaching in the form of altitude and air pressure, and the subtle shift in the engine's note. Brandon packed his book in his bag. He zipped his backpack. He held his unaccompanied minor folder in his lap, the orange one with everything in it, and he held it the way you hold something you refuse to be separated from. The man beside him woke up as the seatbelt sign dinged, snorted, rubbed his face. The woman on the other side opened her eyes and looked out the window at the gray-brown spread of Chicago below. Nobody spoke to Brandon. He was okay with that. He didn't need them to speak to him. He needed 20 more minutes, and then he needed his father. The wheels hit the runway with the controlled force of a thing falling and catching itself. The cabin lurched. The reverse thrust roared. The plane decelerated across the runway in that grinding mechanical way that always felt more dramatic than it needed to, and passengers grabbed armrests and exhaled, and then it was done, and they were taxiing, and the seatbelt sign was still on. But people were already reaching for the overhead bins, and their phones were already out, and already lighting up with the flood of messages that had been waiting at altitude. Brandon's phone was already in his hand. It connected to the ground signal before they reached the gate. The notifications came in like a wave, not from his friends, not from his cousin, but one after another from his father. Text messages. 3 of them. The first, "I know what happened. I'm at the gate. Don't say anything to anyone until I get to you." The second, "You did nothing wrong. I'm so sorry, son." The third, "I'm proud of you. I'll see you in a minute." Brandon read them in the order they came. Read them again. His jaw was very tight. His eyes were doing something. He was fighting against something that the last 2.5 hours of iron self-control had been holding back, and the 3 text messages from his father were the first crack in that control, not because they were dramatic, but because they were specific and real, and they meant his father knew, and knowing meant he wasn't alone in it anymore. He breathed, in, out, slow. The plane reached the gate. The jetway connected. The seatbelt sign went off, and the cabin erupted into the immediate organized chaos of deplaning, everyone standing at once, everyone reaching overhead at once, everyone performing the universal choreography of arrival. Nobody asked Brandon to stay put. He sat. He sat in 34B with his backpack on his lap and his phone in his hand and his unaccompanied minor folder held against his chest, and he waited while the plane emptied around him. First class would deplane. First, that was the protocol, and he understood the irony of it without needing to dwell on it. He would go last. He would wait. He was good at waiting now. He could hear the front of the plane, the professional goodbyes, the thank yous, the see you next times. He could hear Cynthia's voice somewhere up there, performing the farewell the way she performed everything flawlessly professionally, with the total confidence of someone who had no idea that the ground beneath her was about to open. One by one, the seats around Brandon emptied. Economy cleared out row by row, people shuffling toward the front, the overhead bins clicking open and shut. The man who smelled like cigarettes left without looking at him. The sleeping woman left without looking at him. The woman with the crackers stopped as she passed his row, looked at him with her reading glasses still pushed up on her head, and said simply, "I hope your daddy fixes this." "He will," Brandon said. She nodded once, walked on. Melissa, the young flight attendant who had come to apologize, appeared from the front galley. She walked the now empty aisle to row 34. "Okay," she said quietly. "Time to go." Brandon stood up. He shouldered his backpack. He held his folder. He walked. He walked the aisle that he had walked 2 hours ago, in the other direction, from first class to economy, from a seat his father had given him to one he'd been exiled to. He walked it now in reverse, through economy, through business class, through the galley curtain. Cynthia was still there, standing at the forward door doing something with paperwork. She looked up when he came through the curtain. Their eyes met. He walked past her without a word. Down the jetway, the long, slightly downhill tube between the plane and the gate, Brandon could see the brightness of the terminal ahead. He could hear somewhere beyond the end of the jetway the ambient noise of O'Hare. He walked toward it with his back straight and his breathing slow, and his father's words on his phone screen still burning somewhere in his chest. And then he reached the end of the jetway, and he stepped into the gate. And he saw Derek Fletcher standing 10 feet away from him, and Derek Fletcher was not alone. He was flanked by 2 men in Sky Vault operations uniforms and a woman in a business suit who was holding a tablet and speaking into an earpiece, and every single one of them had the focused, arriving energy of people who had not come here to be gentle. Derek took one look at his son, at the orange folder, at the backpack, at the face that had held itself together for 2.5 hours, and he crossed the space between them in 3 steps and wrapped both arms around him. Brandon held on, just for a moment, just long enough. Then he stepped back, stood straight, looked up at his father. "She blocked my Wi-Fi," he said. "I couldn't call you." Derek looked at his son. His jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the kind of cold, absolute clarity that comes when the thing you feared most has already happened and there's nothing left to fear. "I know," he said. "That's over now." He straightened up. He turned toward the jetway door. He put his hand gently on Brandon's shoulder, and Brandon felt the weight of it, protective, present, immovable. And the 2 of them stood there, father and son, facing the jetway door that Cynthia Holloway was still walking through, paperwork in hand, professional expression intact, completely unprepared for what was waiting for her at the end of the ramp. She stepped through the door into the gate. She saw Derek Fletcher. The paperwork hit the floor and nobody moved to pick it up. Cynthia Holloway stood at the mouth of the jetway with her hand still extended in the position it had been in when the papers left it, and she was looking at Derek Fletcher the way people look at something they've convinced themselves couldn't be real, with a kind of stunned, recalibrating terror that isn't fully formed yet, because the brain is still running calculations, still trying to find the version of this moment where she walks away from it intact. She didn't find one. Derek Fletcher wasn't a physically imposing man. In the obvious sense, he wasn't loud, wasn't large in a way that filled a room with noise. What he was still. Completely, precisely still. The kind of stillness that takes years to develop and only comes to people who have learned that the most dangerous thing they can do in a moment like this is move too fast. He stood with his hand on his son's shoulder, and he looked at Cynthia and he said nothing. Not yet. He let her stand in the silence she had created, and the silence was enormous. The 2 operations men behind him were quiet. The woman in the business suit had stopped speaking into her earpiece, the gate area around them. Passengers from the flight still milling with their luggage, a few of them slowing down, sensing something went a register quieter, the way crowds do when something real is happening, and they can feel it without knowing what it is. Cynthia's professionalism kicked in. You had to give it to her, it was deeply ingrained. She straightened. She picked up the papers from the floor. She composed her face into something that was trying to be neutral and landing somewhere closer to frightened. She said, "Mr. Fletcher, I wasn't expecting— No, Derek said. You weren't. A beat. I want to explain what happened on the flight, she said. I know what happened on the flight. He said it without heat, without anything. That was what made it so absolute. I have the incident log from departure. I have the seat change documentation, the one that was never properly authorized. I have the Wi-Fi access denial. I have the timeline. He paused. I have my son. Cynthia's eyes moved to Brandon. Just for a second. Then back to Derek. Sir, there was a concern about cabin management. He was sitting in his seat. There were questions about the unaccompanied minor protocol. He had every document, filed by me, confirmed by my own airline system. Derek's voice hadn't risen. It hadn't needed to. He was 11 years old, with a valid first-class ticket, a completed authorization file, and a meal he was looking forward to. And you took the menu out of his hands and told him first class wasn't for kids like him. Cynthia said nothing. Those are your words, Derek said. Not mine, his. She opened her mouth, closed it. There's nothing to explain, Derek said. Not to me, not here. He looked at the woman in the business suit who stepped forward with her tablet. We'll need your crew ID and your statement before you leave this terminal. Karen will walk you through that process. Cynthia looked at the woman with the tablet, Karen apparently, and something in Cynthia's face went through a very fast, very painful sequence of emotions. The professional mask cracked at its edges. Am I— She stopped, started again. What is happening right now? An investigation is opening, Karen said calmly. Standard protocol for an unauthorized, unaccompanied minor incident. We'll need your full account of everything that occurred on Flight 1147 from boarding through landing. I want to call my union representative. That's your right, Karen said. You can do that after we get your initial statement. Cynthia's jaw tightened. I'd like to do that now. Cynthia. Derek said her name once, not loudly, but with the precision of a man who has said names in boardrooms for 20 years and knows exactly what that precision does. She looked at him. What you said to my son, in a cabin full of people who heard every word that doesn't go away because of who's in the room with you or who you call. You understand that— She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Karen will take it from here, Derek said, and he turned back to his son. Brandon had stood through all of this the way he'd stood through everything on that plane, straight-backed, quiet watching. His father put both hands on his shoulders now and crouched slightly so they were at eye level and looked at him directly. No one else. Just him. Are you hurt? Derek asked. No, Brandon said. Are you hungry? And that word, that single, simple human word, did what nothing else had managed to do in 2.5 hours. Brandon's face moved, just slightly, just enough. Yes, he said. Derek nodded once. He stood back up. Then let's get you something to eat. They walked away from the gate together, father and son, while Karen began her quiet, efficient process behind them, and the operations men stood their ground, and Cynthia Holloway stood in the ruins of the last hour of her career and tried to figure out where exactly she had miscalculated. She had miscalculated from the beginning. She just didn't know yet how many ways. Derek took Brandon to the Delta Sky Club, not because it was the closest food option, but because it was private, and he wanted his son somewhere quiet. He ordered Brandon a proper meal without looking at the menu from memory, the way fathers do when they know their children. A turkey club, a bowl of tomato soup, a Sprite, not a water. Brandon ate without being told to steadily, and without drama, and Derek sat across from him and drank a coffee he didn't touch and watched his son eat and worked very hard to keep his face from showing everything it was feeling. He mostly succeeded. Tell me from the beginning, he said when Brandon was halfway through the sandwich. So Brandon told him. He was precise, he didn't dramatize. He gave Derek the sequence the way he gave everything in order with detail, without editorializing beyond what was factual. The menu, the words, the call from Cynthia to Gerald, the purser's decision, the walk to 34B, the hunger, the Wi-Fi denial, the woman with the crackers, Cynthia coming back to take even that away, the man in 33A who told him to let it go. every piece of it from boarding to wheels down. Derek listened to every word without interrupting once. When Brandon finished, he picked up his Sprite and took a sip and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "The purser," he said. "Gerald Watts." "Yes, sir." He saw the documentation. He read the whole folder. Then he told me to gather my things anyway. Derek nodded slowly, the nod of a man running a very controlled internal process. And the passengers in first class, nobody said anything. One man looked like he was about to. Then another passenger looked at him and he stopped. Which seat was that man in? Brandon had noticed. Of course he had. 2C, and I think the man who stopped him was across the aisle. 3C maybe. Derek's expression was unreadable. Not cold exactly, but calibrated in a way that made it clear that every piece of information Brandon was giving him was going somewhere specific inside his mind, being sorted and filed and attached to its consequence. The flight attendant who apologized, Derek said, "Melissa, she couldn't do anything officially, but she came back to check on me." "She came to you in economy specifically?" "Yes, sir. Said she didn't agree with what happened, that she couldn't say it earlier." Derek took a long breath, let it out slowly. "Okay. Are you going to fire everyone?" Brandon asked. Derek looked at his son. Something moved in his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "Why?" "Melissa tried to help me. The woman with the crackers helped me. The man who almost said something he couldn't do it, but I could see he wanted to." Brandon paused. "I think there's a difference between the people who did the wrong thing and the people who just didn't have the power to do the right one." Derek was quiet for a moment. Then, "When did you get this old? I've been thinking a lot on airplanes," Brandon said. This time Derek did smile. Brief, tight, weighted with everything underneath it. He reached across the table and put his hand on his son's forearm, just for a second, just enough to make contact. And then he sat back and picked up his coffee, and the mechanics of what came next began moving behind his eyes. What Derek Fletcher did not tell his son, not then, not in that room, was that the investigation that was opening was not a standard one. It wasn't the routine review that Karen had described at the gate, measured and procedural, and likely to result in a written reprimand and mandatory retraining. That wasn't what was happening. What was happening was something that Derek had set in motion from the car on his way to the airport when he'd had 40 minutes of driving time and a phone that he'd used with absolute deliberateness. He'd called his general counsel first, then his head of human resources, then his chief operating officer, then the chair of SkyVault's board, in that order for specific reasons. By the time he'd walked into O'Hare, there were 4 people in 4 different offices who understood that this was not a personnel matter. This was a company matter. And company matters at SkyVault went through Derek Fletcher. He had built this airline, not inherited it, built it. From a regional carrier with 6 planes and a staff of 90 to a national airline with over 200 routes, 1,200 employees, and a reputation he had cultivated with obsessive care over 15 years. He had done it in an industry that had not made it easy, in a country that had not always made it easy. And he had done it anyway because that was the only mode Derek Fletcher knew. You did it anyway. You built it anyway. You refused to let the resistance define the ceiling. He had not built it so that his son could be told he didn't belong in a first-class seat. The investigation opened officially at 4:17 that afternoon, while Brandon was finishing his soup. It was the fastest formal review in SkyVault's history. Not because Derek had circumvented the process, but because the process, when driven from the top, moved at a different speed than it did when it was waiting for someone to have the courage to escalate it. By 5 o'clock, Gerald Watts had been called into the operations office at O'Hare. He arrived expecting a debrief. He found Karen, the COO, on speakerphone and his own personnel file open on the table. He went very pale. "I want to understand your decision-making process," the COO said through the speaker, his voice even and precise in the way that voices get when they are performing professionalism over something much more urgent. "Walk me through what happened from the moment Holloway came to you about the minor in seat 2A. Gerald had rehearsed something. You could tell he had the slightly too smooth cadence of a man who had been composing sentences in his head since the plane landed. "There was a concern raised about cabin dynamics," he said. The attendant flagged a potential issue with an unaccompanied minor and given the needs of the first-class service. The child had complete documentation, Karen said. A fully authorized unaccompanied minor file, a valid first-class ticket 0 record of disruptive behavior. What specific policy provision authorized you to move him? Gerald paused. My judgment as purser. Your judgment as purser operates within Skyvault policy. Which policy authorized the move? Another pause. Longer. Mr. Watts, the COO said, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to understand that your answer is being documented. Did you move that child based on any documented rule violation or policy concern? Or did you move him because a flight attendant told you he didn't look like he belonged in first class? The silence that followed was approximately 6 seconds long. 6 seconds in which Gerald Watts sat across from a table with his personnel file in front of him and made the calculation that defines certain kinds of people, in certain kinds of moments, the calculation between the truth and the version of the truth you tell when you're trying to protect yourself. He chose wrong. I made a professional judgment based on the attendant's assessment and the management of the cabin, he said. Karen wrote something down. Thank you, the COO said. We'll be in touch. Gerald left the room and walked down the O'Hare terminal corridor and understood somewhere in the part of himself that dealt in realities that his career had just moved into a different category. He didn't know yet what that category was called. He would find out. Meanwhile, the story was leaving the airport. It started small the way these things always do. The woman with the reading glasses, the one who had given Brandon crackers whose name was Diane Okafor, who was a retired school principal from Evanston, and who had a Facebook page her grandchildren had set up for her that she updated more than they expected, had been thinking about what she'd witnessed the whole drive home. She sat at her kitchen table, and she typed it out. Not in a dramatic way. In the way a retired school principal writes things factually with full sentences and with a clarity that came from 40 years of describing events to parents who needed to understand what had happened to their children. She described Cynthia taking the menu. She described the words. She described the walk to economy. She described Cynthia coming back to stop the crackers. She described the man who told Brandon to let it go. And she ended it with the sentence, "This child did everything right and was treated like a problem the entire flight. I have never been more ashamed of a group of adults in my life, and I spent 40 years managing school boards." She posted it at 6:14 in the evening. By 7, it had 40 shares. By 8, it had 400. By 9, someone had screenshotted it and posted it on Twitter. And by 10, it was on Facebook groups with names like Travel Horror Stories and Parenting Today and Black Parents Network. And it had been shared 1,200 times, and the comments were running at about 5-1 in the direction of absolute incandescent fury. Derek's communications team flagged it at 10:37. He was still in his office. He read Diane Okafor's post in its entirety. Read it twice. Then he pulled up the screen that showed the engagement numbers, the shares, the comments, the rate of spread, and watched it for a moment, the way a navigator watches a storm system approaching on radar. He picked up his phone, called his communications director. "I need a statement by morning," he said. "Not a corporate one. From me. First person. My name." "Do you want to run it by legal first?" "No." A pause. "Okay. Do you want—" "And I want to find Diane Okafor," he said. "The woman who posted. Get me her contact information, respectfully publicly with her consent. I want to thank her." He paused. "She fed my son crackers when no one else would do a damn thing." The communications director was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, sir." Derek hung up. He turned his chair toward the window. Below him, Chicago ran its nighttime business headlights moving on the expressway, the city humming with its 10 million particular concerns, indifferent and enormous, and beautiful in the way all big cities are beautiful at night when you're high enough to see the shape of them. He thought about Brandon, who was with his mother tonight. Derek had called her from the car, told her the outline of it, kept his voice steady for that conversation, the same way he kept it steady for all the hard conversations. She had said very little. She was not a woman who said a lot when she was feeling a great deal. He knew that about her. He respected it. He thought about their son who had sat in a middle seat for 2 hours and not broken, who had looked Cynthia Holloway in the eye and asked her with perfect calm, "What did I do wrong?" He thought about who had taught Brandon that. He thought about what it cost the teaching of it. The specific, exhausting, necessary labor of raising a black child in America to be that precise, that composed, that iron-spined in the face of something that should never have happened in the first place. The anger was still there. It was going to be there for a long time. But underneath it, or maybe more accurately alongside it, was something that felt like a door opening. Like the moment when something that has been private and tolerated becomes public and accountable. He had built an airline. He had the mechanism, he had the platform, he had a son who had handled himself with more dignity than the adults responsible for his care, and he had a woman named Diane Okafor in Evanston who had given him crackers because she was the only person on that plane willing to do a human thing. He was going to do something with all of this. He didn't know the full shape of it yet, but it was coming. His phone buzzed, a text from Brandon. 9:45 at night, which meant he was supposed to be asleep and wasn't. The text said, "Did you find out if she got fired?" Derek typed back, "Investigation is open. Don't worry about that tonight." 3 dots. Then, "I'm not worried. I just want to know." Derek looked at the message for a moment. Then, "Go to sleep. I'll tell you everything tomorrow." 3 dots. Then, "Okay, Dad." "Yeah." "You should know when she came back to check on me in economy." She wasn't checking on me. She was checking to see if she'd won. Derek read that twice. He thought about his 11-year-old son, who had identified the psychology of a bully with more accuracy than most adults manage in a lifetime. He thought about what that kind of insight costs a child to develop. He thought about every flight, every room, every moment that had accumulated into the education that produced that particular sentence. He typed, "I know, get some sleep." He put the phone down. He turned back to the window. The city below didn't know yet. By morning it would. By morning, Diane Okafor's post would have crossed 100,000 shares, and the news desks would be making calls, and SkyVault's corporate communications line would be ringing with the frequency of something that can no longer be managed quietly. And somewhere in that same city, in a hotel room near the airport, Cynthia Holloway was sitting on the edge of a bed with her phone in her hand, and the union representative's number on the screen, trying to work out whether the version of events she'd decided to present was still viable. Trying to remember with precise accuracy who had been in that cabin, who had seen exactly what, whether anyone had recorded anything. She went through it slowly, systematically. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. It was one of the things she prided herself on. She accounted for every passenger she could remember. She felt the architecture of her defense taking shape the way it does when you are a careful, experienced person who has spent a career managing situations. She had not yet thought of Diane Okafor. She had not yet thought of the Post. She had not yet thought of the 1,200 shares that were becoming 2,400 while she sat on that hotel bed, or the comments section that was growing with the specific, relentless energy of people who recognize something and refuse to let it go unnamed. She pressed call on her union representative's number. It went to voicemail. She left a message. She set down her phone. She looked at the ceiling of a hotel room near O'Hare Airport, and she thought about the folder of papers she had read on that plane, the orange, unaccompanied minor folder with Derek Fletcher's signature on the authorization form, a signature she had seen without registering its full meaning, and she thought about the moment at the gate when the papers fell from her hands. She thought about the boy. She thought about what he had said. What did I do wrong? And for the first time since she had reached across that menu and taken it from his hands, Cynthia Holloway sat in the silence of what she had actually done, without the professional language to dress it up, without the cabin management framework to justify it, without anything between her and the plain, undecorated truth of a flight from Atlanta to Chicago, where she had told an 11-year-old boy that a first-class seat wasn't for kids like him. She sat in that silence for a long time. Diane Okafor woke up to a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating. She was a woman who slept with her phone on the nightstand because her grandchildren sometimes called late, and she'd set it to allow notifications from close contacts after hours. What she had not anticipated was that by 6:45 in the morning, she would have 412 notifications, 11 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and a voicemail from a Chicago Tribune reporter who said she was working on a story and would very much appreciate 5 minutes of Diane's time at her earliest convenience. Diane sat up in bed, put on her reading glasses, read the first 20 comments on her post. Then she set the phone face down on the nightstand and sat very still for a moment, the way she used to sit before difficult parent conferences, gathering herself. Then she picked the phone back up and started reading more carefully. By 7:15, she understood what had happened. By 7:30, she had called her daughter, the one in Naperville, the sensible one, and described the situation in full. Her daughter said, "Mom," in a tone that meant several different things simultaneously, and then said, "Don't talk to any reporters without knowing who they are first." "I know that," Diane said, "and don't delete the post." "Why would I delete the post? Every word of it is true." Her daughter sighed with the particular exasperation of a child who loves their parent completely and finds them occasionally terrifying. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'm coming over." At 8 o'clock, while Diane was making coffee and her daughter was 40 minutes away on the expressway, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, a Chicago area code, but not one she knew. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Mrs. Okafor." A woman's voice. Calm, professional, warm in a calibrated way. "My name is Patricia Huang. I'm the communications director for Skyvault Airlines. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Derek Fletcher, who is the CEO and founder. He asked me to reach out to you personally. He wanted me to tell you, and I'm quoting him directly, that what you did for his son on that flight was the most decent thing that happened in that cabin, and he'd like to thank you himself if you're willing." Diane sat down at her kitchen table. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The boy's father owns the airline." "Yes, ma'am." "Lord," Diane said quietly, not as an exclamation, as something more private than that. "Mr. Fletcher completely understands if you'd prefer not to speak with him. He wanted to make the offer, but there's no pressure whatsoever. He also wanted you to know in case you were concerned that the boy is fine. He's home safe with his family." "I know he's fine," Diane said. "I could tell he was going to be fine. That child had his father's backbone, even if he'd never met the man in an airport before." She paused. "I would be glad to speak with Mr. Fletcher." Patricia Huang said she'd arrange a call within the hour. Diane hung up. She looked at her kitchen. At the ordinary Tuesday morning surrounding her, the coffee maker finishing its cycle, the neighbor's dog barking outside the particular quality of April light coming through the window over her sink. She thought about the moment she'd leaned forward and held out those crackers. The most instinctive thing she'd done in years. She hadn't thought about it. She'd just done it the way you do things when you have spent 40 years watching children, and you know the specific expression on a child's face that means someone should do something here. She'd just been the someone. She didn't think that was remarkable. She thought it was the minimum. She poured her coffee and waited for Derek Fletcher to call. He called at 8:22. His voice was exactly what she'd expected, measured direct, carrying that particular quality of controlled feeling that men learn when they have learned the hard way to control it. "Mrs. Okafor," he said, "Mr. Fletcher, I understand you fed my son crackers at 35,000 feet when an entire first-class cabin couldn't find it in themselves to say one word." "They were just crackers," Diane said. "To him they were considerably more than that." A pause. She could hear him deciding something. "I want to ask you, with your permission, if I can mention your name publicly in the statement I'm releasing this morning. I want people to know that someone did the right thing." Diane thought about it. Not long she wasn't a person who needed long for these things. "You can use my name," she said, "but if you mention me, you mention the young flight attendant too, Melissa. She came back to economy to check on him when she didn't have to. She couldn't do much, but she showed up." A beat of silence. Then, "Brandon told me about her." "She was afraid," Diane said. "But she came anyway. That's worth something." "Yes," Derek said. "It is." Another pause. "Mrs. Okafor, on behalf of my family, thank you." Diane picked up her coffee cup, held it in both hands. "You take care of that boy," she said. "He's something special, but you probably already know that." "I do," Derek said. "Every day." She hung up. She was still sitting at her kitchen table when her daughter arrived 20 minutes later and found her with her phone face up and her reading glasses on, and an expression that her daughter had learned in 53 years of being her child meant that her mother had already decided what to think about something and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up. Derek's statement went out at 9 o'clock. It was 4 paragraphs, no corporate language, no passive voice, no reference to an incident that fell short of our standards, or a situation that did not reflect our values. The usual architecture of institutional apology designed to acknowledge without admitting. It was written in the first person, and it started with his son's name. It said, "Yesterday, my 11-year-old son, Brandon, was removed from a first-class seat he had every right to occupy on SkyVault Flight 1147, told by a senior flight attendant that first class isn't for kids like you. Denied food, denied access to contact me, and spent 2.5 hours hungry and alone in a middle seat in economy. He did nothing wrong. He had valid documentation, a valid ticket, and the kind of composure under pressure that most adults I know would be hard-pressed to match. What happened to him was wrong. It was discriminatory, and it happened on my airline." The second paragraph described the investigation. The third described SkyVault's commitment to accountability. The fourth was 2 sentences. "A woman named Diane Okafor, a retired school principal from Evanston, gave my son crackers and stood up to the flight attendant when the adults with actual authority in that cabin chose silence. She is the standard I am holding this company to." By 10:30, the statement had been screenshotted and shared 40,000 times. By noon, it was on CNN. By 1 o'clock, it was the top trending topic on Twitter, and the comment sections across every platform were producing the particular heat that comes when a story touches something people recognize, something they've felt, witnessed, experienced, survived, and suddenly there is language for it and permission to say so out loud. SkyVault's customer service line was running at 4 times normal volume. Derek was in back-to-back meetings moving through the operational consequences of the morning with the focus of a man who had been preparing for this moment in some form since the car ride to O'Hare. His legal team, his HR leadership, his board liaison, his communications director who was managing an inbox that had grown to a volume that required triage. Through all of it, Derek was present and specific and exact, asking precise questions, making clear decisions, delegating with the confidence of someone who knows which decisions are his alone to make. At 11:45, his HR director, a woman named Valerie Cross, who had worked with Derek for 9 years and had seen him in every professional register he possessed, looked at him across the conference table and said, "Cynthia Holloway's union rep has requested a formal hearing before any termination decision. That's their right." "I know it's their right," Derek said. "Schedule it." "It'll delay." "Schedule it." He paused. "I'm not circumventing her right to representation. I'm going to let the process work. But I need everything documented, every statement, every piece of system data, every passenger account we can obtain, ready for that hearing." Valerie nodded. "Gerald Watts. Same process." Derek looked at the table for a moment. "Valerie, I need the employment records going back 3 years. Complaints, commendations, anything that was filed and how it was handled. Both of them. I need to know if this is the first time or if there's a pattern that someone buried." Valerie's expression shifted by a very small degree. "You think there's a pattern? I think an airline that allowed what happened yesterday to get as far as it did has probably allowed other things to get as far as they did." He looked at her directly. "I need to know what I don't know." She wrote something on her notepad. "I'll have something for you by end of day." What Valerie Cross would find by end of day was not what anyone wanted to find. In Cynthia Holloway's personnel file, there were 2 prior complaints, both filed in the last 18 months, both by Black passengers, both describing language and behavior that echoed with uncomfortable precision what Brandon Fletcher had experienced. One had been reviewed by a station manager who marked it as resolved through mediation. The other had been escalated once before stalling in a queue that no one had prioritized enough to clear. Valerie brought the files to Derek at 4:55. He read them at his desk alone without his communications director or his legal team or anyone who might modulate what he was about to feel. He read both complaints in full, the specific language used, the specific moments described, the careful, measured words of 2 passengers who had been told their concerns were heard, and then had those concerns placed in a folder in a filing system where they had sat undisturbed while Cynthia Holloway continued to work the Atlanta to Chicago corridor. He set the files down on his desk. He sat for a long time. Then he called Valerie back. "Who reviewed the first complaint?"
he asked. She told him. And the second? She told him that too. I want meetings with both of them tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. He paused. And I want the names of the passengers who filed those complaints. We owe them a phone call. Another pause longer. An in-person one. Valerie said she'd set it up.
He hung up. He reached for the family photo on the corner of his desk, the one from 2 summers ago at his sister's lake house, Brandon in a life jacket with the huge, unguarded grin of a kid who has forgotten for a moment to be careful about where he is. Derek looked at that photo and thought about the conversation he had not yet had with his son, the one that was coming, the one every black father has in one form or another at one moment or another, with the specific weight of knowing you cannot protect them from everything and the specific lifelong grief of that knowledge. He had thought he had more time. He was not sure now why he had thought that. His phone buzzed. A text from Brandon's number. Derek looked at it. "Dad, I saw your statement. You said my name." Derek typed back, "You okay with that? 30 seconds, then, yeah, I just didn't expect it." "You were the one who held it together," Derek wrote. "People should know that." A longer pause this time. Then, "There are kids saying it happened to them too, in the comments, a lot of them." Derek read that twice. He thought about what it meant that an 11-year-old was reading the comment sections of a viral news story about himself and was not focused on the attention or the validation or the vindication, but on the other kids, on the pattern. "I see that," Derek typed. "I'm looking into it." "Good," Brandon wrote. Then, "She still hasn't apologized." He was right. Cynthia Holloway had issued no personal statement. Her union representative had put out a brief formulaic line about the process being respected and the investigation being premature, which was the legal equivalent of saying nothing while appearing to say something. Derek had expected it. It didn't make it less remarkable. "She will," Derek typed, "or she won't. Either way, it's not going to change what happens next." Brandon's response took a full minute. Derek waited. Then, "I keep thinking about what she said. Not because it hurt me, but because she said it like she believed it. Like she wasn't even trying to be cruel. She just thought it was true." Derek put the phone down on his desk. He picked it back up. He typed, "That's the part that matters most. You understood something it takes most people much longer to see. Is that why you're doing more than just firing her?" Derek looked at that sentence. His 11-year-old son at home reading comment sections had already intuited that this was bigger than one person's termination. Had already grasped the shape of what Derek was building toward, not because Derek had told him, but because Brandon Fletcher had his father's instinct for the architecture of things. "Yes," Derek typed. "We'll talk about it this weekend, all of it." "Okay," Brandon wrote. Then, "Dad, yeah, I'm not scared anymore. I was on the plane, but I'm not now." Derek read that 3 times. He thought about what it took for a child to say that, not for sympathy, not for reassurance, but as a statement of fact, as an update. "I was in one condition, I am now in another." The clarity of it. He typed, "I know. I could tell when I saw you at the gate." "Really? The way you walked off that jetway, back straight, folder in your hand, headphones around your neck." He paused before typing the next part. "Like you were daring the world to try it again." No response for a moment. Then a single emoji, a small, quiet fist. Derek set the phone down. He looked out the window at Chicago in the late afternoon, the city going amber at the edges, the traffic thickening on the expressway below. He thought about what came next. Not tonight. Tonight he would go home and he would sit with his son, and they would eat dinner and talk about normal things for as long as normal things could hold. But after that was already in motion. At 5:30, Valerie Cross got a call from a passenger on Flight 1147, a man named Thomas Brower, the man in seat 2C, the one who had looked at Brandon and then looked away, the one who had made eye contact and chosen his laptop. He said he'd seen the statement. He said he'd been sitting with it all day. He said he wanted to give a formal account to the investigation, a complete one, including what he saw and what he chose not to do about it. Valerie took his information. She told him someone would be in touch. She hung up and sat with the call for a moment and then sent Derek a message that said simply, "Passenger from 2C called in. Wants to give a statement. Said he didn't do enough." Derek read it. wrote back, "Get his statement and treat him with courtesy." He meant it. Genuine accountability, the kind that comes from a person deciding on their own, without compulsion to walk toward what they got wrong, was rare enough that when it appeared, it deserved to be received with something other than contempt. Thomas Brower couldn't undo what he'd chosen in seat 2C. But he was choosing differently now. Derek understood the weight of that. By 6 o'clock, the story had gone international. A British tabloid was running it, a French news aggregate. A Canadian broadcaster had picked it up with a segment called An American Story. The angle varied by outlet, but the core of it stayed the same: the child, the seat, the words the father, the airline. The story had the particular durability of things that are true and simple, where the truth doesn't require interpretation, only witness. At 6:15, Gerald Watts, who had spent the day in the particular hell of a man who has made a wrong choice and knows it, called Skyvault's HR line and said he wanted to amend his statement. He said he wanted to be honest about what had actually happened. He was told the formal hearing would be the appropriate place for that. He said he understood. He hung up and looked at the wall of his apartment and thought about an 11-year-old boy holding an orange folder, patient and precise and iron-spined, asking him a question he hadn't had a true answer for. "I showed you every piece of documentation my father filed. What did I do wrong?" He hadn't had an answer then. He didn't have one now. There wasn't one. That was the point. There had never been one. At 7 o'clock, Derek finally left the office. He rode the elevator down with his jacket over his arm and his phone in his pocket, and the accumulated weight of the day sitting somewhere behind his sternum, the way weight does when you've been holding it up with pure will since the moment you read a system flag and an operations alert and felt your blood go cold. He got in the car. He didn't call anyone. He drove. He thought about the 2 passengers who had filed complaints before Brandon, who had used the appropriate channels, submitted the appropriate forms, waited in the appropriate ways for the appropriate responses, and received forms in return, mediation language, the institutional equivalent of a door closing quietly on something that deserved to be heard. He thought about what it meant that he hadn't known, that the system he had built, the airline he had built, had produced those files and then swallowed them, that somewhere in the gap between what he had intended to create and what he had actually created, 2 people had been failed in ways that now had names. He pulled off the expressway. He thought about what he was going to build from this. Not just the investigation, not just the consequences for Cynthia and Gerald, not just the statement that was already being quoted on 5 continents, but the actual structural thing. The thing that would mean the next Brandon Fletcher had something different waiting for him. He'd been turning it over since last night at his office window, and it was taking shape now with the specific clarity that comes when grief and purpose find each other and decide to move in the same direction. He knew what he was going to call it. He'd known since Brandon's text the night before, "I just want to know," and the text before that she came back to check if she'd won. His son had given him the name without knowing it in the most natural way, the way children give you the truest things, without effort, without ceremony, in a text message at 9:45 at night, from a bed he was supposed to be sleeping in. Brandon's seat. That was what he was going to call it. He didn't know yet, sitting in his car outside his house in the dark of a Tuesday evening, that within 72 hours, the phrase would be everywhere, that journalists would use it in headlines, that people would put it in profile bios, that parents across the country would send him messages describing the moment they explained to their own children what it meant and why it existed. He didn't know yet what it would become. He just knew what it was going to be. He sat in the car for one more minute. Let the silence of it, the ordinary private silence of a man in a car outside his own house, settle around him. Then he took a breath, opened the door, walked toward the light in the front window that meant his son was still awake waiting for him. He knocked twice before he used his key, their thing a signal. A small private language between a father and a child who'd been raised to know that even when you have a right to something, you announce yourself. You let people know you're coming. He heard footsteps from inside, fast ones. The door opened. Brandon was in his pajamas with his phone in his hand and his headphones around his neck, and he looked at his father with the face of a child who has been through something real and is still standing. And Derek Fletcher looked at his son, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Brandon said, "I saved you some food. Mom made too much." Derek's chest moved. "Yeah, it's your favorite." He walked in. The door closed behind him. The night outside continued its business, the story moving across time zones. The comments section, churning the investigation, logging its first full day of documentation, the 2 prior passengers waiting for calls they didn't know were coming, and inside the house, a father sat down at a kitchen table, and his son put a plate in front of him, and the world for just a few minutes contracted to the size of something manageable and warm. The morning after Derek Fletcher sat at his kitchen table and ate the food his son had saved him, the world he woke up to was different from the one he'd gone to sleep in. Not because the facts had changed, but because the facts had finally found an audience large enough to feel like a reckoning. His phone had logged 417 messages by 6 a.m., not from friends or colleagues or board members. Those had been handled the night before. These were from strangers, from people who had seen the statement and the post and the news segments and had felt something unlock in them, some compressed, long-held thing that had been waiting for permission to speak. They wrote from Atlanta and Oakland and Detroit and Houston and Birmingham. They wrote from London and Toronto and Johannesburg. They wrote in the measured language of people who had been careful for a long time and were suddenly not being careful anymore. And what they said, in hundreds of different ways, with hundreds of different specific details, was the same thing: this happened to me. This happened to my child. This happened to someone I love, and we filed the form, and we made the call, and we were told it was handled, and nothing changed. Derek read 50 of them before he got out of bed. He put the phone face down on the nightstand. He stared at the ceiling for exactly 90 seconds. Then he got up because there was no version of this morning where he was the kind of man who stayed in bed. Brandon was already awake when Derek came downstairs. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the one his mother strictly regulated screen time on, the one she had apparently decided on this particular morning to make an exception for. He was reading. Not social media, not games. He was reading the comments, the ones from other kids. Derek stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. "How long have you been up?" Derek asked. Brandon looked up. "Since 5. Your mother know that. She made me eggs." He glanced toward the kitchen. "She's on the phone with Grandma." Derek pulled out the chair across from his son and sat down. "What are you reading?" Brandon turned the laptop to face him. The screen showed a Twitter thread, not from a journalist or a celebrity, but from a 14-year-old girl in Memphis who had written in 17 posts about the time she'd been removed from a priority boarding line at an airport because the gate agent decided without asking that her ticket must have been a mistake. She'd had the ticket. She'd had every right to be in that line. She'd been 10 years old. Her mother had filed a complaint. The complaint had been acknowledged and then quietly shelved. "There are hundreds of these," Brandon said. He wasn't saying it for sympathy. He was saying it the way he said everything as information, as fact that deserved to be treated as fact. "Kids my age, some younger, some older, all the same story, just different planes and different airports and different words." Derek looked at the screen, then at his son. "I know. Are you going to do something about all of them?" Derek didn't answer right away, not because he didn't have one, but because his son deserved the real answer rather than the fast one. "I can't fix every airline," he said, "but I can make mine the proof that it can be done differently. And if I do it right, if it works, other airlines have to answer for why they aren't doing the same thing." Brandon considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's slow," he said. "Yes," Derek said. "It is. But it's real." "Yes," Derek said. "It is." Brandon nodded. He turned the laptop back to face himself. "Okay," he said. And that was it. No drama, no grand statement, just the nod of a child who has taken a piece of information, processed it, and filed it correctly. Derek looked at his son and felt the specific complicated pride of a parent watching a child be more than you'd had the courage to hope for. He went to make coffee. Behind him, Brandon kept reading. The formal disciplinary hearings began 4 days after the flight. Cynthia Holloway arrived at SkyVault's HR offices in Chicago with her union representative, a pragmatic, experienced man named Robert Delray, who had spent 20 years protecting airline employees and who had read the statement, read the post, read the passenger accounts, and privately told Cynthia the night before that their best path was to come in with a complete, honest account rather than a defensive one. She had not slept well. She had not slept well in 4 days. The quality of her sleep had been deteriorating in direct proportion to the growth of the comment sections she had been told not to read, and had read anyway. She sat down across the table from Valerie Cross and the company's general counsel, and a woman from the company's external investigation firm, and she looked at the faces of the people who held her career in their assessment, and she understood with a clarity that 4 days of bad sleep had actually sharpened rather than dulled, that the story she had prepared in the hotel room near O'Hare, the careful architecture of cabin management language and professional judgment frameworks, was not going to survive this room. Robert Delray, to his credit, had told her that too. She put her prepared statement on the table. She looked at it, then she looked up. "I want to give you a different account than what I submitted initially," she said. The room was very still. "I moved that child because I didn't think he belonged there," she said. "Not because of a policy violation, not because of cabin management needs, because I looked at him and I made a decision about him before he'd done a single thing wrong." She stopped, started again. "I've been in this business for 19 years. I know what I'm supposed to say right now. I know the language. I've used it before." Another stop. "I don't want to use it, because I think if I use it again, I'll be able to keep telling myself a version of this story that lets me off the hook, and I've been sitting with this for 4 days, and I don't want that anymore." Valerie Cross sat very still across the table. She had been in HR for 22 years. She had heard a lot of things across tables like this. She had not heard many things that sounded exactly like what she was hearing right now. "Go on," she said quietly. Cynthia talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the 2 prior complaints acknowledged, then confirmed the behaviors described were accurate, confirmed that the mediation she'd undergone hadn't changed anything because she hadn't believed she'd done anything that needed changing. She talked about the flight in specific, granular, unflinching detail. She talked about the moment she took the menu. She talked about the walk to 34B. She talked about the crackers. She talked about the Wi-Fi. At the end of it, Robert Delray was looking at the table. Cynthia looked at Valerie Cross and said, "I want to apologize to Brandon Fletcher, not through a statement, not through a press release, directly, if his father and his family are willing." Valerie wrote something, said, "We'll pass that request along." Cynthia nodded. She looked at her hands. "I know what the outcome of this hearing is," she said. "I'm not asking you to change it." She was right about the outcome. She had known it since the night the papers fell from her hands at the gate. The formal termination came through 6 days after the flight, the investigation having documented the 2 prior complaints, the specific conduct on Flight 1147, the unauthorized seat change, the Wi-Fi denial, the food refusal. The termination letter cited multiple policy violations and conduct unbecoming of a senior crew member. It was thorough and complete and documented in the way that things are documented when the person who built the company is also the person driving the investigation. Gerald Watts received a formal demotion and a final written warning. He had amended his statement, fully acknowledged his failure of judgment, and the investigation had concluded that while his decision had been wrong and professionally indefensible, it had not risen to the level of the original conduct. He accepted the demotion without appeal. He did not return to the Atlanta to Chicago corridor. Melissa Tran, the young flight attendant who had come to Economy to apologize, who had told Brandon she didn't agree and couldn't say it earlier, received a commendation in her personnel file. Derek had insisted on it. Valerie had written it. It cited her for demonstrating moral integrity in a difficult environment, and it was specific enough that anyone who read it would know exactly what it referred to. Melissa read it 3 times when it arrived. She called her mother afterward and didn't say much. Didn't need to. Thomas Brower, seat 2C. The man who had looked at Brandon and looked away, and then spent a day sitting with what that meant, gave a complete witness statement. He also sent a personal letter addressed to Brandon Fletcher through Skyvault's communications office. Derek read it before deciding whether to pass it to his son. The letter was 2 pages long and contained no excuses. It described what Thomas had seen, what he had felt, what he had calculated in the moment, the precise internal cost-benefit analysis that had produced the decision to look back at his laptop, and it said plainly that the calculation had been wrong and that he had known it was wrong when he made it, and had made it anyway. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said he wasn't writing for that. He said he was writing because the boy deserved to know that at least one of the adults who had failed him understood exactly how and why he had failed. Derek gave the letter to Brandon on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table and sat with him while he read it. Brandon read it twice. He set it down. He thought for a moment. Then he said, he knew. While it was happening, he knew it was wrong, and he didn't do anything. Yes, Derek said. That's actually harder than if he just didn't know. Derek said nothing, because his son was right and some truths don't need commentary. Brandon folded the letter carefully, put it in the orange unaccompanied minor folder which he had kept, which he had placed on his desk in his room, which had become in the way of children's objects, a kind of talisman, a documentation of something he had survived. He slid the letter in with the other papers and closed the folder. I don't forgive him yet, Brandon said, but I don't hate him either. You don't have to do either right now, Derek said. I know. He looked up. Tell me about what you're building. So Derek told him. He told him about Brandon's seat, the full version, the one that had been taking shape since the night at the office window, and had solidified into a program with a structure and a budget and a partnership with 4 nonprofits that Derek had spent the better part of a week calling personally. He described what it would do, provide first-class travel experiences to children from underserved communities, partnering with schools and youth organizations to identify recipients, covering every cost, ensuring every child who participated had the full experience, the seat, the meal, the treatment that any other first-class passenger received. He told Brandon about the training initiative that would accompany it, a mandatory unconscious bias and inclusion program for every Skyvault crew member, built not around policy compliance, but around what he called the Diane Okafor Standard, the minimum of human decency that a retired schoolteacher from Evanston had demonstrated without thinking twice. He told him about the new complaint review system, an independent oversight body that would sit outside the normal HR chain with the authority to escalate any passenger discrimination complaint directly to executive level within 48 hours. Brandon listened to all of it. When Derek finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I be involved in Brandon's seat?" Derek looked at his son. "What do you mean?" "I want to be there, when the kids fly. I want to be the one who not like a spokesperson or anything." He paused, finding the words. "I just want them to know that someone who sat in that seat is still sitting in it. You know, Derek had built 2 companies in his life. He had sat across the table from investors who could move markets and politicians who could move legislation, and journalists who could move public opinion. And he had done so with the composure of a man who understood that most things worth having require you to hold your position in the face of pressure. He had held his position through all of it. He was holding it now across a kitchen table from his 11-year-old son, and he was finding it harder than it had ever been. "Yeah?" he said. "I know." "Then yes," Derek said. "You can be there." Brandon nodded. "Good." He picked up his orange juice. "And Dad?" "Yeah. We should invite Diane." Derek almost smiled. Almost. "Already did," he said. "She said yes." Brandon did smile, full and unguarded and 11 years old and real. "I figured she would." The public launch of Brandon's seat happened 3 weeks after Flight 1147. Derek held it not at a corporate press event, not in a ballroom with branded backdrops and prepared remarks, but at a school on the south side of Chicago, in a gymnasium that smelled like rubber floors and institutional cleaning products, and the specific warm energy of 300 children who had been told something good was happening and were choosing to believe it. He spoke for 12 minutes. He didn't use notes. He talked about his son. He talked about Seat 2A. He talked about what the flight had revealed, not just about one flight attendant, not just about one airline, but about the accumulated silence of people who see wrong things happening and calculate the cost of speaking and decide the math doesn't work. He said the math was wrong. He said the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of speaking. It just takes longer to arrive. And then he said something that was not in any press release, not in any prepared language, not in anything his communications director had seen before he said it. He said, "My son sat in a middle seat for 2.5 hours, and he held himself together with more dignity than I have managed in entire years of my adult life. He held himself together, not because he wasn't angry, he was angry, he told me so, but because he understood at 11 years old that the way you leave a room matters as much as the way you enter it. He walked off that plane the same way he walked on it, straight back, head up, folder in his hand." He paused. "That is not something I taught him. That is something he taught me." Brandon was in the third row. He was wearing a gray sweater, and his headphones were around his neck out of habit, and he was sitting next to Diane Okafor, who had come in her best blue blazer with her reading glasses in her front pocket, and who had reached over and patted his hand exactly once when Derek started talking, and then left him alone because she was above all things a woman who understood the difference between support and intrusion. When Derek said that last part, the part about the folder about the straight back and the head up, Brandon looked at his hands. His jaw went tight the way it had been tight on the flight. But this time, there was nothing to hold back from. This time, there was only the gymnasium and his father's voice and 300 kids who were about to have something named after him. And the weight of it was a different kind of weight, not the weight of something pressing down, but the weight of something being handed over carefully and deliberately, like something precious. He took a breath. Let it out. Diane leaned over and said quietly, "You doing okay, baby?" Brandon looked at her. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said, and she meant it. The first cohort of Brandon's seat flew 6 weeks after the launch. 12 children ages 9 to 14 from 4 schools on Chicago's south and west sides. Each one had a first-class ticket, genuine full-fare window seat where available. Each one had the meal, the warm nuts in the little dish, the real cutlery. Each one was greeted by name by crew members who had completed the new training and who had been told clearly and explicitly that the standard on these flights was not a special standard. It was the standard applied to everyone every time. Brandon was on the flight. He sat in 2A, the same seat number, different plane, and he didn't make a thing of it. He just sat down, put his bag under the seat, and when the 9-year-old girl across the aisle from him looked at the menu with the slightly stunned expression of someone encountering something she had been told was real but hadn't fully believed until now, Brandon leaned across and said, "The warm nuts are the best part. Don't let them take yours." The girl looked at him. "Who would take them?" "Nobody," Brandon said. "Not today." She considered this, then she picked up her menu and began reading it with the focused attention of someone who intended to make the most of every single option. And Brandon leaned back in his seat and looked out the window at the tarmac and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a word for yet. He would find one eventually. He was the kind of person who found words for things. But for now, it was just there. Warm and specific and real, the feeling of a door that had been used to exclude you being taken off its hinges and laid flat so that everyone could walk across it. The flight was quiet. The flight was ordinary. The flight was by every external measure unremarkable. That was the point. In the months that followed, Brandon's seat grew. A second cohort, a third, a fourth school joining the partnership, an organization in Atlanta requesting a chapter, then one in Houston, then one in Philadelphia. Other airlines began receiving questions from journalists. Why don't you have something like this? And the questions were uncomfortable in the specific way that questions are uncomfortable when the answer is that nobody in the building had decided it mattered enough to build. 2 of them built it anyway within the year, because of what Derek had created and because of the visibility it had, and because, and this was the part that Derek noted privately without satisfaction, but with clarity, the business case had become impossible to ignore. Parents choosing airlines, travelers choosing carriers, consumer behavior moving decisively and measurably toward the company that had stood up and named what happened and changed something real because of it. Cynthia Holloway sent a written apology to Brandon Fletcher 7 weeks after her termination. It arrived through SkyVault's communications office. She had no other channel to use, and it was 3 pages long, and she had written it 7 times before the version she sent was the version that didn't protect her. Derek read it. He gave it to Brandon's mother first, who read it and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Give it to him." Brandon read it at his desk with the door closed. He was in there for 20 minutes. When he came out, he said to his mother, "She actually said it." Said what? That she looked at me and decided who I was before I'd done anything. She actually wrote those words. He paused. I didn't think she would. Does it help? His mother asked. He thought about it. Really thought the way he thought about everything. It doesn't undo it, he said. But it's something. It's at least true. His mother nodded. She pulled him into a hug that he allowed with the slightly self-conscious tolerance of an 11-year-old who still needed it more than he'd admit. She held on. You changed something, she said into the top of his head. I need you to know that. I didn't do anything, Brandon said. I just stayed in my seat. His mother pulled back. She looked at her son, at the steadiness in his face, the same steadiness that had been there on that plane, that had been there at the gate, that had been there every single day since. And she said, that's the whole thing. That's exactly the whole thing. And she was right. Because what Brandon Fletcher had done, what an 11-year-old boy in a first-class seat had done on a flight from Atlanta to Chicago, was not remarkable because he had fought. He hadn't fought. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded an audience or manufactured a confrontation. He had done something far more difficult than any of those things. He had stayed. He had held his ground with the documentation in his hand and the truth on his side, and the calmness of a child who had been raised to know that dignity is not something that can be taken from you, it can only be surrendered, and he had refused to surrender it, not for 1 second, not for the entire 2.5 hours, not for any of it. He had walked off that plane the same person he walked on it. And in doing so, he had started something that neither Cynthia Holloway's worst instincts, nor a cabin full of silent adults, nor 34 rows of distance between a first-class seat and a middle seat in economy could have stopped, because truth, when it is held with that kind of patience and precision, does not need a big moment to move. It just needs a person willing to carry it all the way to the end of the jetway, back straight, head up, folder in hand. Derek Fletcher built an airline. And his son at 11 years old on a Tuesday afternoon at 35,000 feet reminded him what it was supposed to be built for. Brandon's seat still flies, every month, every city, every child in that window seat looking down at clouds they've never seen from that angle before, holding a menu nobody is going to take from their hands. That is what justice looks like when it's built to last. Not a verdict, not a termination, not a headline that fades in a week, but a seat with a child's name on it, and the ironclad promise that as long as that airline flies, every child who boards it belongs there completely and without condition, exactly as they are.